if someone can make me a co-host or do something like that.
It's telling me that I can just make you a host, so I'm just going to do that.
Okay, good. So then maybe I'm controlling the other aspects of it, so that's
Yeah.
fine. I'll be happy to do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and put on the screen just a few prayers. I think it's always nice, especially for a set of teachings like this, to start with a mandala offering, and not that it has anything to do with me. The mandala offering prayer is really about imagining a vast, pure offering, as big as you can imagine it, the entire phenomenal world, just completely filled with pure, beautiful substances. And we're making that vast, pure offering to the Buddhas and to our teachers, the gurus, so that we can achieve all the realizations of the path, particularly what we're going to be talking about tonight and, of course, throughout this week. So, again, we'll just recite this in English. If you would like to recite with me, that's perfectly fine. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryata Yami. Then the next prayer we'll do before we do a little meditation is taking refuge in bodhicitta, generating bodhicitta. So again, most of you are familiar with this prayer. But the first 2 lines are renewing, refreshing that sense of safe direction that we feel in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, especially the Dharma, the teachings themselves. And then in the last 2 lines, cultivating that motivation of bodhicitta, thinking that we're here together in this virtual Gampa with the intention of listening to these teachings, engaging in them together, so that we can each work on ourselves to achieve complete enlightenment and then help others to do that same work. So let's do this once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi pe sonam gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chenyen Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog. Okay, thank you for dealing with my bad chanting voice these days. Anyway, let's go ahead and do a short meditation before we begin. This will just give us a chance to focus the mind a little bit, maybe let go of whatever distractions we might have from the day, preoccupations, worries, what have you. And then after a few minutes of focusing the mind, we'll generate our motivation of bodhicitta in a more formal way. So again, most of you have a technique you already use with the breath. You're welcome to do that for the next few minutes in silence. If you need a suggestion, then generally I suggest working with the area around the nostrils where you feel the air coming in and out as you inhale, as you exhale, and just focusing on wherever that sensation is. For some people, it's just inside the tip of the nose, some people on the upper lip. But just make that your meditation object. And whatever, mode of working with the breath that you've chosen, the object, of course, is to stay with the breath as best as you can. And then whenever you notice that the mind has wandered away from that and gotten distracted, let go of whatever distracted you and gently return to the breath. So I'll ring the chime here and we'll start the meditation period. Again, just a few minutes in silence, and then I'll lead you in a short meditation to set motivation for tonight. So now to set our motivation for tonight, I thought it might be good to begin with just a short reflection to examine in your own life to what extent you've allowed problems to become hindrances, obstacles to your well-being. You know, the times that we're living in, we have lots of things that we can see as problems. Tonight we're going to be exploring this idea that maybe these problems are actually great opportunities for us. But no doubt each of us has our habitual way that we tend to deal with problems. Maybe even the things that we do when we're confronted with difficulties in our lives. Sometimes it can be becoming angry at the situation. Sometimes it can mean becoming depressed. I might end up sleeping a lot, trying to escape our problems in that way. Sometimes we even overindulge when we are dealing with problems, but it's good to just take note of how is it that you tend to deal with problems. And then from the space of recognizing those patterns, to open up to the idea that perhaps we could make better use of the problems and the difficulties that we experience in our lives. To just be open to that idea for tonight. But to do this, again, with this motivation that not just seeks the peace of mind that you will have if you're able to confront your problems and work with them in this way, which of course is part of what we do gain by working with our problems and learning to like them, as tonight's title suggests. But moreover, we will be in a better position to help others when we're not so preoccupied with our own suffering, our own difficulties, and falling into those habitual reactions. We actually will be there for others, there to help others, to reach out to them in their suffering. And if we do all this work tonight with the motivation of bodhicitta, we can actually go even beyond just the immediate help that we can provide others. Because what we will be doing tonight, we can dedicate and, really hold in our hearts that we're doing this for the development of our own selves completely, to remove all of our own obscurations, everything that hinders our spiritual progress, and to develop and enhance all the positive qualities that we'll be touching on tonight, all the understanding and compassion, the caring and love that we can generate. That will be the way to be able to effectively respond to the suffering of the world. So hold this motivation of bodhicitta in your heart, recognizing that this is a precious opportunity we have tonight to spend these 2 hours investigating this topic that is here, presented by the Buddha as an opportunity for us to use everything that we meet as grist for the mill, to be able to make our lives incredibly powerful and become enlightened very quickly so we can then benefit others. Okay, great. So again, tonight's topic is this idea of learning to like problems. And no doubt each of you have come across these teachings at one time or another. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction into them. But this is obviously a really important topic because if we look at our lives, and as I mentioned in the motivation tonight, especially what we're going through in this world right now, there are lots of problems. And of course, some of us have greater problems than others. And certainly when we look at the world, we can see many people who are certainly being affected in much greater ways than what some of us are, perhaps by the pandemic and by the economic problems and so on. Just no end, it seems, to problems and difficulties. But of course, these teachings are here because, as I was suggesting in the motivation, if we sort of shut that part of our life out, if we think, okay, well, those are my problems, those are my difficulties, I need to deal with them in their own way. But then I have my spiritual life where I meditate on compassion and loving kindness and all these wonderful things. And that's just kind of its own separate thing. Well, then we're missing a huge opportunity, especially at times like this, when there are a lot of problems. And even those who aren't affected quite so much by this pandemic are still affected. They still have problems. They still have difficulties they have to deal with, challenges in their life. So again, this is a very precious teaching for us to be able to make use of everything on the path. And of course, we have to change our attitudes towards problems as we're looking at tonight. So I have prepared a little bit of a slideshow. There's not quite as many slides for tonight, perhaps, as what I sometimes do for some of my teachings online, but at least to be able to go through some of the main points. And I'm happy to make these slides available to uh, Catherine, Heather, whoever there, who would, if they would like to pass them on to those who signed up for this course, put them on your website, whatever works. I'm happy to share these. So I've got quite a few quotes from Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Oops, how did it do that? Quite a few quotes from Lama Zopa Rinpoche's book. Lama Zopa, of course, is our spiritual director of the FPMT. I think a number of you have had the pleasure of meeting Rinpoche before. He's got an amazing book that I'm kind of using as, again, a bit of a starting point for a lot of the discussion tonight. And actually, in this book, he refers to a text that I occasionally teach on for an entire weekend because it's so rich in detail and so many wonderful things to look at. But this is an amazing book that I would really encourage you to look into if you haven't had teachings on this topic before. He says, transforming miserable conditions into necessary conditions that help us move along the path to enlightenment has great benefit, especially in the exceptionally difficult times in which we live. Of course, if I look at the date of when this book was written, the original version I think was around 2000. Actually, this one is 2001, but I think there was even an earlier one than this. So, Rinpoche is sort of talking about whenever we live, because there are always difficulties in any age, in any time. But this is the gist of what we're going to be talking about tonight, is taking those miserable conditions, those difficulties, and making them into something that actually enhances our qualities, helps us to move further on the path to enlightenment on the Lam Rim. So I've divided up tonight into four areas. The fourth one is, of course, what I want to spend most of the time on. I will take a break maybe about midway through. I think it's good on these 2-hour lectures to at least have a 5 to 10 minute break. We'll see where everybody's at then. But just a chance to get up and stretch, because sitting in front of a computer screen for 2 hours isn't everybody's favorite thing to do. So tonight we'll start with the context for these teachings, which won't take me long. It's just to talk a little bit about where these fit into the Lam Rim and the teachings of the Buddha. The second topic will be our ordinary view of problems, kind of how that is problematic in itself, to kind of play on that word, how we are not really looking at problems in the correct way according to how the Buddha advises us to work with them. And then how we then need a different attitude in order to transform those problems into happiness, in order to kind of learn to like them. And then we'll go into the actual techniques to do this, which does draw from not just Rinpoche's commentary, but of course that's a commentary on this text by Jigme Tempe Nima, I think is the name of the Lama. And the text is in the back of Rinpoche's commentary. It's a very short book. I think it's under 100 pages, this book. But anyway, it's a very rich text that has a lot of wonderful advice about not just transforming suffering into the path, into our problems into happiness, but also how do we work with our good experiences. And maybe I'll touch on that a little bit at the end if we have time, but there's a lot to cover tonight. So let me go ahead and get right into the material. So again, we tend to call this a part of what's called lojong. The idea of transforming or working with our problems. In Tibetan, the bigger genre of teachings that this is included in is lojong, which is usually translated as mind training or thought transformation. I think thought transformation is Rinpoche's preferred language. And so essentially we could say that the general teachings of the Buddha on taming or changing the mind are thought transformation. Those of you who've been involved in Buddhism for a while know that the Buddha's expertise is in the mind and how we work with our thoughts to change what we're thinking and to therefore respond to things in our lives more honestly, more in line with truth, to actually have a more accurate way of working with things in our lives. But the specific sort of teachings that have come to be known as lojong are these techniques that we're going to look at tonight for developing and enhancing the Mahayana motivation of bodhicitta. Now, lojong has been around as a sort of corpus of teachings for quite a while. Of course, it's rooted in the Mahayana teachings of the Buddha, but nonetheless, it came to Tibet about 1,000 years ago by this amazing master who most of you have heard of, Lama Atisha. Lama Atisha was a great Indian Buddhist practitioner who went to great lengths. And it said that he traveled all the way to Indonesia, to Sumatra, to receive many of these teachings on developing these qualities that enhance our wish to benefit others and so on. And he brought them all into Tibet when he was invited there. He spent a number of years in Tibet and is renowned for having created the Lam Rim tradition, which I'm going to look at in just a second and kind of give the context of lojong and Lam Rim, the stages of the path teachings. So Lama Atisha brought with him, of course, also all these other teachings, including what has come to be known as lojong. In lojong itself, mind thought transformation was taught just to a select number of disciples, and disciples of the highest motivation and the highest caliber, because they're really challenging teachings. They are kind of going against the grain of the normal habitual ways that we deal with things in our lives. So they're very, very powerful teachings because of this, because they're going against the grain, because they have an ability, if we work with them skillfully, to actually transmute what are negative situations into very positive ones. And of course, this is a bit of like Buddhist alchemy, if you will. And so the teachings on lojong, there are many of the texts that constitute that. In fact, there's a huge volume that the Wisdom Publications has produced as part of their library of Tibetan works. That is the whole corpus of the collected mind training teachings, all of what has come to be known as lojong, which starts with Lama Atisha's teachings and goes into all of the Tibetans who followed. And again, I can't get into all of that tonight. That's beyond the scope of this, but know that there are many teachings that sort of are in this category. Of course, as I said, they are part of the Mahayana tradition, part of the greatest motivation we can bring to Buddha's teachings. So the next slide kind of shows then, those of you who aren't familiar with the Lam Rim, the term I just mentioned, Tibetan Lam means path, Rim means sort of stages or graduated. And the idea is that we have these graduated levels that we go through on our path to enlightenment. So we start, just like in our education and traditional secular education, we start with a grade school, kind of elementary school. We begin with the small scope in the Lam Rim, which is where we learn the initial teachings of the Buddha that help us to recognize what we are involved in, that we need to be kind of determined to make sure that at the end of this life, we have a good rebirth. Now, again, in Buddhist teachings, as well as many of the Eastern traditions, rebirth is taken for granted. It's a concept that many people still struggle with. And of course, there are a number of concepts within Buddhism that people might struggle with. But this is sort of the setting for the Buddha's teachings, is to kind of work with that idea, with that sort of working hypothesis that there is rebirth, that there are factors that determine our rebirth. And in the very first level of our Buddhist education on the stages of the path, we learn the teachings that help us to have an effect on that process. Quite specifically, the teachings on karma. In the middle scope, which is comparable to our high school or some sort of intermediate education, that's where we look at the big picture in terms of we've been cycling, going from life to life in samsara or cyclic existence since beginningless time, but we can be free from that. And we can know the teachings that will help us to do that by generating a sincere wish to move out of that state of samsara and to attain the state that we call nirvana. So again, this is the first two scopes are really primarily concerned with our own well-being, our own gaining of a good rebirth, our own freedom from going from life to life under the control of these factors, our karma and so on, all of our deluded states of mind that are keeping us in this type of an existence. So having gone through those two levels of education in the first two scopes of the Lam Rim, we end up at the great scope, where we take the motivation beyond ourselves to recognize that everyone else is in the same predicament that we find ourselves in. And here we generate that motivation that I just guided you in cultivating, the motivation of bodhicitta, bodhicitta, bodhi meaning awakening, and citta meaning the mind, or so that's often called the mind of enlightenment or the mind of awakening. And the idea is it is the intention to achieve Buddhahood, to go beyond just one's own freedom from suffering, from cyclic existence, and become fully enlightened so we can then help others. So the teachings of lojong are within the great scope. Like I said, they're very high level teachings, and they're especially for those courageous bodhisattvas, those beings who have this mind of bodhicitta, who really want to take advantage of everything in their lives to move quickly along the path to enlightenment and become enlightened for the sake of others, so we can then help them, most skillfully. So the great scope is where all of these teachings are located, and more specifically, they are part of the teachings that help to cultivate bodhicitta. Um, I'm going to, again, not go into those in great detail tonight, but there are generally taught two techniques to generate this mind of awakening. And one of them involves developing a real sense of closeness to other beings. The other one is rooted in the lojong teachings, and it's about recognizing that we have this self-centeredness that becomes very problematic for us, and we need to let go of that and become focused on others. And so some of the teachings we're going to get into tonight actually do touch on how we work with our problems and our difficulties to get in touch with the suffering of others, to be cherishing them and holding them very dear, to move away from our self-centeredness, to actually embrace the welfare of other beings. So again, tonight is we'll be touching on topics that are within the entire Lam because whatever we're working with in terms of our own individual practice, we can use lojong techniques to transform what we're experiencing in terms of a problem into something that enhances our path. And this is the concept, again, that we're going to get into in more detail in just a moment. So again, the Buddha's teachings on lojong that were encapsulated by Lama Atisha are primarily to help us at the great scope level, but it's not to say, again, that they don't also enhance and work with some of the teachings that are on these other levels. That are necessary steps in the process. The great scope would be comparable in our education to university or even graduate school, where we kind of have an ability to work with things at a much deeper level. But you don't get to university without having gone through elementary school and high school. So again, that's the idea behind the graduated path. Let's look at our, this whole concept of our ordinary view of problems, which maybe I don't need to talk about so much because most of us probably have this already. But, in our daily lives, and if we look at the world around us and how most people relate to their problems, they put so much of the onus on their own well-being, their happiness. They put all that onus on the outside world, on what is going on. And so oftentimes when we ask people, how are you doing? And they start talking about, maybe there are those people, some people just say, oh, I'm fine, they don't really get into it. But some people will talk about what's going on. They might start talking about, oh, well, there's this happening and that happening, as if these external events are what dictates whether one is doing well or not. Of course, this emphasis on the external world and on external experiences is, according to the Buddha, problematic. Why? Because it's actually the internal world that determines the state of things and interprets them, if you will. Our own minds have much greater control than we give ourselves credit for. I always use the example of these amazing athletes. I've never been that athletic. I used to do like track and field and cross-country running and things like that when I was in high school. I was never into the contact sports and things like that. But there are athletes who spend a lot of time dedicating themselves to their sport. And they even go to huge unbelievable places in terms of experiencing pain and pushing boundaries in terms of all of that. Well, how can they do that? If someone asked me to do half the things that people do in training to become an Olympic athlete, I would say, no, thank you. That's really not something I care to do to myself. I don't even have that desire to kind of go through that. But they have a mindset that allows them to endure some of the pain and suffering that they have to go through in order to get to some greater goal. And of course, with the Buddha, in pointing at that example, that's just one worldly example of how the mind is stronger than what we are experiencing physically. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often emphasized this, that the mind is supreme. It sort of has the greater control over it. And he even uses the example sometimes of how we can say, well, if the external situations are bad, sometimes you can still have a very good mind in the space of that. And I'm sure there are many people who are using not just Buddhism, but other spiritual practices or even just their own, inner work to be able to be content in the midst of what's going on in our world right now. But he says there's also the example where you might have things going really well on the outside. You have no problems, no difficulties, no health problems. Everybody around you is very joyous and happy and supporting you, and everything's wonderful. And you can still be really, really in bad mental shape. Well, that shows that, again, the external factors are not what dictates the state of one's own happiness or well-being. Where does that come from? It comes from our own minds. So this is, again, as I said, everything the Buddha taught is some form of thought transformation. But these teachings are specifically designed to help us to work with our minds when we fall into these sort of traps of things happening that then bring our mind down. And we're going to look mostly at that in terms of problems and difficulties. The text that I mentioned that Rinpoche comments on in his book actually goes into both things, as I mentioned this earlier, transforming problems and difficulties into the path, but even transforming the good times, the happiness we have in our path. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in his book, Awakening the Mind, Lightening the Heart, he talks about how we have two times that become problematic for our spiritual development. One, of course, is what we're talking about tonight. When we have problems and difficulties, sometimes these weigh us down so much that we find it really hard to engage in our spiritual practice. We find it hard to deal with life. And as I said in the motivation tonight, we have our habitual things that we do. We go to the fridge, or we go to bed, or we go to indulge in Netflix, or we do whatever it is that kind of gets our mind into a place where we need that external thing to kind of overcome the effects of these external problems that we're experiencing. This is not a good thing. If we allow the external world to dictate our ability to practice the Dharma, well, then we're missing, again, a huge opportunity to practice the Dharma when things are not good, especially, again, in times like we're living through right now. The other situation His Holiness talks about is when things are going well. When everything is humming along fine and we're having a good situation in our lives, well, then we become complacent at those times. We often think, well, I don't really need the Dharma, because the Dharma is kind of there to address the deficiencies and what have you. And actually, my life's going really well. So why do I need to practice a spiritual path? So the traditional Lamrim texts actually, and lojong texts actually deal with both of these, transforming the problems and the difficulties, as well as even transforming the good situations, the good times. But we're going to leave those aside tonight. As I said, maybe at the end I might talk about that, because what's over here in terms of this stuff is the more challenging thing for us. And again, I certainly, have talked to many people over the course of these last months and dealing with the pandemic and all the problems. And you can see how it weighs very heavy on some people's minds. And it becomes something that does become an obstacle for them. Well, who is choosing to see it as an obstacle? And I'm not denying that these things are happening. And the Buddha never said your problems aren't happening. That's not the way that you do this thought transformation, is to simply deny your problems. Denial isn't going to get you very far. You almost have to really accept that you have problems, but then you have to choose to look at them differently. I looked this up on the internet, and I don't know how true it is, but I heard many years ago about this idea of the Chinese character for crisis is also the same character for opportunity. And this, again, is something we know in our culture. Even we hear this in business often, right? That uh, look at your problems, your difficulties, the crises that you face as actually great opportunities, because they are. And we can see that even in our worldly efforts and activities, that if we actually roll up our sleeves and go after something that appears to be a problem, we can make it into something that helps us to grow, that helps us to develop our skills and our abilities. Well, it's no different in the spiritual path. And that's really the heart of what we're looking at tonight in terms of how do we change our minds in regard to this so that we overcome our habitual way of looking at things. To identify something as a problem is already problematic, as I said earlier. That already pegs it as something that is an obstacle, that is a hindrance. And so we're going to keep using this term of transforming problems, but the whole idea is to not see them as problems, to not see them as, obstacles, to not let them get in the way, but to actually be something, as we've implied in the title of this, that we learn to like, that we actually go, oh, good, I have this happening in my life. Now I get to work with this because this is a really rich opportunity. This isn't just, something that's going to get in the way and make me miserable and make me eat too much and do whatever the case might be. You notice I'm talking about food a lot. That seems to be one of the things I do during this time. Just find myself at home so much that it's hard, to avoid the fridge. But nonetheless, we all have, again, those habitual ways that we look at problems and that we work with them. Do those really get us where we want to be? Do they really help us? Are they really something that increases our qualities and our abilities, or do they get in the way? And again, this is so that we don't shut out that part of our life. So let's look at the next topic. Actually, maybe I even have a couple of quotes first before we go on to that topic. I like to pull, again, a few quotes from Lama Zopa's book. He says, happiness and suffering are dependent upon your mind, upon your interpretation, is kind of his words of saying what I just went through. They do not come from outside, from others. All of your happiness and all of your suffering are created by you, by your own mind. Of course, this is also implicit within the teachings on karma that we will be looking at a little bit later. But everything that we experience is a karmic creation. All the feelings that we have, be they good feelings, pleasant feelings, be they unpleasant or painful feelings, neutral feelings, all of these are karmic ripenings. They are created through the force of our own mind in the past, and how we interpret them in the moment is up to us in regard to our own outlook, our own way of perceiving things. Rinpoche goes on to say, you must clearly recognize that your problems are actually necessary conditions for your practice of virtue, and you can derive continual, stable happiness from this. Because this is the shift that we're talking about tonight, to kind of move away from our tendency to see them as, obstacles, but to look at them actually as needed conditions, as, exactly what the doctor ordered. The good doctor of the Buddha, has given us exactly what we need to work on. So the different attitude that is needed to transform our problems into happiness essentially entails a couple of things. Let's first look at Rinpoche's quotes on this that I thought were useful to kind of get us in the ballpark of this. He says, in these difficult times, obstacles to practicing Dharma and achieving ultimate happiness are so numerous that you simply cannot avoid them. There are certain problems, such as having many demands on our time, or being sick, or ultimately dying, that we will inevitably experience. We have no choice. And this is the nature of problems, right? Is that it's not like I can get up in the morning and say, oh, no, I don't want that problem in my life. And no, I don't want that problem, but maybe I'll take that one. Things come into our lives and we don't have a whole lot of choice over that. These are, again, the ripenings of our own past karma, that when conditions are met, they come into our lives and they appear as problems, as difficulties. When these circumstances arise, Rinpoche says, you must be able to transform miserable conditions and unwanted obstacles into beneficial and necessary conditions that further your Dharma practice and help bring ultimate happiness. So this shift in attitude that's needed, is essentially to be able to look at this and say, wow, this thing that appears to be an obstacle could be incredibly beneficial. And not just beneficial, but as he keeps pointing out throughout his book, necessary. It's not like there's some choice. It's at some level in our development, we recognize that we have to work with those things in a different way. These are needed. They are actually what helps us to develop something that will ripen into our own Buddhahood. Just like I've been teaching on Monday evenings for the New York group and the Miami group, Master Shantideva's Chapter 6 on patience. And of course, in the context of patience, especially when we look at the harm that we receive from other people, I just was going through some verses on Monday where we need those people in our lives. If you don't have irritating, annoying, difficult people in your life, then you can never fine-tune your patience, right? They're a necessary component for accomplishing that. Well, they're included, of course, in this category of problems because they also are problems. But of course, what we're talking about tonight includes anything that we would consider to be a problem. We need all of that. Why? Because in the face of those problems and difficulties, if we can work with our minds to transmute, to change them into fodder, into grist for the mill, well, then essentially we will accomplish much greater realizations of things. And the realizations won't happen without that. They're necessary conditions, just like the enemy or the difficult person is necessary for you to practice patience. In the same way, the difficult situations in your life are necessary for you to truly grow and develop, for you to feed into all the various topics of the Lam Rim and to eventually achieve enlightenment. So let's go on back to, I think there's maybe one or two more quotes from Rinpoche before we really get into the meat of things here tonight. He says, if you cannot make use of every condition that arises, both what is undesirable and desirable, as I said, we tend to work with just the problematic stuff in the lojong area, but we also have to work with even the things that we like about life that entice us, that pull us in, and then we also need to transmute those. But if we can't work with every condition that arises, we're in danger of losing the Dharma, and we will never achieve the unsurpassed and lasting happiness of enlightenment. Buddhism is, as most of you know, a sort of 24/7 deal. It means working with everything as much as possible. Now, most of us aren't able to work 24/7 on the Dharma, but we gradually get there by continuing to open up more and more to various aspects of our life, especially those parts of our life that, as His Holiness was pointing out, can become problematic for us. So Rinpoche then goes on to say, you cannot stop your suffering by identifying as a problem some harm that has come to you or some undesirable situation that has arisen, and then thinking over and over again that the condition is a problem. When you encounter an undesirable situation, a thought arises that interprets your experience as a problem, and this causes suffering. So what Rinpoche is saying here, I mentioned this earlier, but I want to emphasize is that your identification of it as a problem makes it a problem. And that's the power of your mind, that when that experience comes in and you label it as problem and see it as problem, relate to it as problem, think about it as a problem, all of that feeds into it being a problem. But if you have this thing that's occurring in your life that you are choosing to look at in a different light, reframing it in terms of this is actually an amazing opportunity. This is a jewel. And most of you know, again, from the lojong teachings that we're even trying to work with that kind of concept of seeing whatever we're experiencing, especially difficult people, as being like our gurus, like our teachers, those who are in our lives to help us to deepen our qualities. This, again, is very powerful stuff, but as I said, quite challenging. In and of itself, it becomes a very difficult practice to maintain. But tonight, again, we're going to get into some of the skills and the techniques that we can use to begin this process, to start to work with it. So Rinpoche then, I think this is the final slide of this section with quotes from him. He says, the only way to stop that suffering is to give rise to another thought that recognizes and interprets your experience as happiness. Only this thought can stop that suffering. Only this thought can quell the unhappy mind. So as I was saying earlier about these athletes, that are looking at kind of really challenging situations, because they are so intent upon the goal and upon accomplishing that, far-reaching thing that means so much to them, they don't look at all the strenuous stuff that they have to engage in, and even the harm that might happen to their body on the basis of all of that work. They see the greater goal as being more important than that. They see the challenges of the hard practices and the difficult weather conditions that they're practicing in and everything else as something beneficial, as even happiness. Again, this is a pretty radical shift. This is what we're going to get into in this last section, is how do we even not just stop framing these things as problems, but even look at them as something delicious and delightful, something wonderful that we can embrace. We actually see them as happiness, which of course we're not trying to, use this sort of mind trick of just, if I choose to see it that way, then it becomes something else. In fact, all the teachings on lojong say that the goal of our practice of lojong isn't to make those things kind of disappear so that they don't become, suffering anymore. The whole point is that you do have something that enters into your life that is suffering. And this is, of course, inevitable for all of us, as Rinpoche was saying earlier. You're going to continue to have problems and difficulties. Things are going to continue to arise in your life. The goal of lojong is not to get rid of those things. The goal of lojong is to learn how to work with those things so that, in a sense, they do become the source of happiness for us rather than the source of consternation and problems and difficulties and so on. So this is, again, just reiterating to some degree, but maybe going a little bit deeper with each of these topics in terms of how we work with this. Oh, there's another slide from Rinpoche. I don't have too many more from him, but I like some of these quotes so much that I felt like I needed to share with them with you tonight. He says, therefore, whenever a problem arises, you can be happy by recognizing it as beneficial, by seeing that it supports the generation of the path to enlightenment and ultimate happiness within your mind. And this is, again, where we're going to go into for the rest of this teaching, is to recognize that we have the ability to choose how we are going to look at any particular situation, that we can actually see this as something that enhances our path, rather than becoming poison and, making our minds disturbed and distressed. So let's look at the actual techniques to do this. So maybe actually what I'll do is I'll stop here, because before we go too far into those actual techniques, which are the rest of tonight, maybe to see if there are any questions or comments from anybody. Um, Again, most of you, I think, have probably had some exposure to these sorts of teachings. I think I even may have taught on the 7-point mind training of Geshe Chikawa once before in Denver. I don't recall. I think I did. But any comments or questions on what we're talking about tonight? I think everybody's understanding it. Yes, I mean, there's no problems with that. It's just practicing it, of course, is the big challenge. Anyone? Okay. So again, if something does come up during the teaching and you don't want to wait till there's a break to ask a question, feel free to put it in the chat box, and I'll, of course, see those and be able to address those. I'll have another opportunity for questions maybe a little bit closer to the end of tonight. But let's go ahead and get into the heart of the matter, which is, what are the techniques that the Buddha taught, or that are part of this lojong tradition, that actually help us to do this, that move us away from seeing things through our ordinary view of disliking problems, identifying them as such, pushing them out of our lives, not wanting to experience them, to actually something that we embrace and we learn to like and even perhaps love. I don't know. So Rinpoche, starting this section, he says, when you meet undesirable conditions, if you spontaneously recognize them as good, you will be happy. During times of criticism, poverty, difficulties, failure, sickness, or even imminent death, nothing will disturb your mind. You will be consistently happy. Of course, we need techniques to see them in that way, and that's what we're going to be looking at in this section, is to switch our minds off from seeing them as something that we don't welcome to something that we actually are happy about. It does take some kind of force behind it, some training, if you will. So then he says, effortlessly, naturally, you will recognize the benefits of problems. And the more you see the benefits, the happier you will be to experience difficulties in your life. That you will actually, as we're finding, in this section, or we will find in this section, we can actually learn to like our problems. And then, again, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I put so many quotes in here of Rinpoche's text, but let's just go through these. And then again, I won't be doing so many more until the very end. It says, to transform problems into happiness, it is not sufficient simply to see that problems help your practice of virtue. This alone is not enough. You must clearly recognize that your problems are actually necessary conditions for your practice of virtue, and you can derive continual, stable happiness from this. I mentioned this earlier. Again, I didn't probably need to put this slide in then, because that was the whole idea that I mentioned previously, that we need to actually see that it's necessary to work with problems this way. So essentially, in the traditional teachings, especially the verse, the work that Lama Zopa Rinpoche comments on in his book, there are two main tasks involved in this. The first is rejecting the state of mind that only wants to avoid suffering. This is our default mind. This is how we live all of our lives, is that we have the expectation that we're going to have a good day, that things are going to go our way, and we do everything possible to avoid suffering, to avoid problems and difficulties. Then we have to also learn to adopt the state of mind that is happy when suffering arises. So in a sense, the first one is to move away from the negative to a more neutral state. And then the second one is to move from the neutral state to a more joyous state, to actually learn, as the title said, to like problems, to love problems, to embrace problems. But the first step is to reject this mental attitude that wants to avoid suffering. So let's look at that first. And in the text by Jigme Tempe Nima, again, this Lama who Rinpoche comments on, he says the first reasoning that we can use for rejecting that state of mind is the uselessness of considering suffering as something unfavorable. That we actually see that our perspective that looks at our problems and our difficulties as undesirable, as something that we don't want to experience, doesn't serve any purpose. Now, again, in that text, he doesn't quote this, but there's a wonderful verse from Master Shantideva that many of you have heard because it's one of His Holiness's favorite verses, and it's from chapter 6 on patience that I mentioned earlier. And it's verse 10. And the gist of it is, if there's something that can be done about a particular situation, well, then why be dejected? And that's showing, again, the uselessness of your dejection because it doesn't serve the purpose of solving the situation. A lot of things that we have in our lives, we actually can do something about. I mean, even if we look at the pandemic we're experiencing, it's not to say that, we can get completely rid of it and do that work ourselves. It's obviously bigger than our individual selves. But in terms of our own self and our relationship to that and what's going on in our world and our own desire to not succumb to the virus and do all these things, we can do something about that. So if we were to get all dejected and bent out of shape thinking we have to avoid anything around this because we're going to, just get sucked into that and negativity and what have you. Well, no, you do what's positive to protect yourself, to do what needs to be done, and you can rest assured that you've done what needs to happen in terms of changing that situation. The second part of Master Shantideva's verse deals with those situations that we can't change, though. He says if there's nothing that can be done about the situation, well, then there's really no use in our dejection. Why? Because our getting bent out of shape in terms of something that is in our lives that we can't do anything about, some of the things Rinpoche mentioned earlier, such as inevitably each of us will have to experience death. Inevitably, we no doubt every one of us have to experience some form of illness, some form of debilitation as we age and so on. So all of these things are things we can't necessarily do something about. But in the face of that, our getting dejected really serves no purpose at all. Why? Because it just compounds our suffering. There's a wonderful teaching that actually does relate very nicely to these lojong teachings that comes from the Pali Canon that I've come across in some other teachings, specifically Larry Rosenberg, who's a member of the IMS Insight Meditation Society that teaches Vipassana techniques and what have you in a lot of centers. Larry Rosenberg, in his book Living in the Light of Death, he mentioned the Arrow Sutra called the Salata Sutta. And in the Arrow Sutra, the Buddha talks about how we do have this first arrow that we all have to experience. The first arrows are problems, are difficulties. Those are going to come into our lives. And sometimes we can do something about that first arrow. That's the first part of Master Shantideva's little verse. We can address that arrow, and it's better for us just to roll up our sleeves and confront and work on changing the situation. But there are a lot of first arrows that come into our lives that we can't do much about. If we look at like the grief that we experience when we lose a loved one, or again, death, or some of the other things I've mentioned already, those are things that we can't possibly change in the moment. So instead of just accepting that first arrow, which is what Master Shantideva is saying in a sense we should do, we compound our suffering. And this is where in the Salata Sutra, the Buddha says that we actually create a second arrow. The second arrow is what we inflict upon ourselves. The first arrow are those external situations, that come into our lives that we may be able to do something about, we may not. But the second arrow is completely in our own control. This is all the mental stuff that we throw on that situation. And what we're looking at in terms of this lojong tonight and this transforming problems, the very first sort of step in all of this is to change the mindset that we have when we experience the first arrow. When first arrow stuff comes in, rather than all the dejection and the worry and the, keeping us up all night and complaining to everyone that we meet and all the stuff that goes on that's part of the second arrow, that's all superfluous. That's all additional suffering that we need not go through at all. Why the Buddha spelled this out in terms of these two levels is because there are, and he tended to point to the first arrow as primarily being physical. And it is true, to a large degree, these are physical things that come into our lives. But we can even have some mental suffering that is on the basis of life events, such as losing a dear friend or what have you, that causes us some grief. But all of the second arrow stuff is purely mental. It's purely our minds going through a process of, looking at things from a angle where we only exacerbate our own suffering. We only keep things moving in a direction that makes us feel more and more miserable. And of course, then we love talking to other people about our misery and creating all of this stuff around it, because then, misery loves company, as they say. And so then we end up just wallowing in this, and we don't really do anything productive with it. And of course, one teacher on the internet, it was an anonymous teaching. It was just posted at a website called American Buddhist. I was reading that one day, and he points out that there's even a third arrow sometimes that we engage in, which is when, on the basis of all the second arrow stuff, on the mental processes that we go through, we then say and do things that create more harm and complexity and problems and difficulties for ourselves and others. It's bad enough that we're sitting in our own little mental stew, but then we start spreading it around and we start creating problems for other people. So there's a lot of our pain and suffering and difficulties that come from our mental processes that follow on the basis of simply first arrow stuff. First arrow stuff is going to happen to us throughout this life. First arrow stuff we can do something about in the long term through changing our karma, but in the moment we have to face those things. We can't just, that's what's so challenging about the situation we're dealing with in our world right now, right? Is because there's nowhere to go where you can completely escape from this. Maybe if you went to Antarctica, I don't think there are any cases in Antarctica yet, but you'd be in Antarctica. I'm not sure that's really the best place to be, So there's very little escape to all of this. So again, those problems, those first arrow things are going to be there. But what are we doing that's second arrow stuff? How are we looking at things? And as that verse of Master Shantideva was, alluding to earlier, that, we've got this tendency of just getting really dejected and worried and totally caught up in our own thought processes about all of this. Does that serve a purpose? Well, if it's something you can do something about, it doesn't serve a purpose at all, because it's deflecting you from doing the actual work to change things in your life. And if it's something you can't do anything about, well, it's really pretty useless then, because it's just keeping you in your own little hamster wheel, and you just keep going around and around and again with all the same thought processes that only inflict more worry and more suffering on yourself. So this first idea of kind of, looking at the futility of our kind of labeling it as something unfavorable, our not wanting to experience it, our complaining about it, our doing whatever. This is a big one for us to recognize that this is not a healthy way of looking at our suffering. The second point, though, is the great harm of considering suffering as something unfavorable. If you live your life day in and day out, and everything that arises that's a first arrow, all those types of experiences that you're going to, again, keep experiencing throughout this life, all the way through to death, those things that come in, not continually, but you're going to see them coming in your life here and there. If you never do anything to change the way that you're looking at that, and always reject it, always see it as unfavorable, always want to push it away, well, then you're never going to develop any strength of mind. Another verse from Master Shantideva's 6th chapter essentially says, I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, there is nothing whatsoever that doesn't become easier through the force of familiarity. And the point is that if we start working with our problems, our suffering, our difficulties, and stop the way that we've been habitually looking at them and start to embrace them and see them not as completely unfavorable as perhaps having something worthwhile about them, well, then we actually can have that as our habit over time. Why do we tend to see things in the negative light? Only because we're habituated to doing that. And of course, as I'm trying to point out tonight and what these teachings are trying to make us aware of, is that that actually isn't even accurate. It's not the full picture. Yes, those are suffering experiences. They do cause you to have pain and difficulty in your life. From that vantage point, we could identify them as problems. But from the vantage point of what we're going to be exploring in the remainder of tonight, they actually have amazing ability to help us to work on our minds. They have great potential to actually practice the path to enlightenment. So there's great harm if we don't embrace our problems in a different light, if we continually see them as something that we don't wish for, that are unfavorable, that we want to get rid of, we want to reject, we fight and struggle against them, we do all that second arrow stuff that doesn't get us anywhere. It doesn't help us to resolve the problem if it's resolvable, and it doesn't, help us to actually work with a situation that we can't change. So again, those two ideas, that it's really useless to continue to see problems in this way. It's also very harmful to ourselves and our spiritual practice if we don't learn to see things a little bit differently. So let me just introduce this next part before we take a little break. The second part is adopting the state of mind that is happy when suffering arises. As I said, we kind of, in the first part, stop seeing suffering as completely unfavorable. Here, we want to actually change the mind to embrace our problems and our difficulties, our suffering, to actually be happy when suffering arises. So what does this mean? This means using one's suffering in conjunction with Dharma teachings, and thus making them a source of happiness. The Buddha taught the Dharma to achieve happiness, so that beings could attain the most profound levels of happiness, as well as even, of course, temporal happiness along the way. But this is the best way to look at our suffering, is that it actually can help us to deepen our understanding of the Dharma, to practice the Dharma with greater tenacity, with greater strength. And then in that way, we can achieve deeper happiness ourselves. But of course, for this to be effective, we must train in applying these techniques. So the rest of tonight that I'm going to go through are all the ways that we can train our minds so that we have that force of skill and familiarity that we can bring to working with problems and difficulties, so that we don't do the second arrow stuff. We do something that is totally radical, totally different. So one more slide, and then we'll take a short break. Rinpoche, in regard to this idea that we have to train, he says, it is essential to be well prepared before actually meeting miserable conditions, since being able to use them as a basis for virtue and happiness is extremely difficult. And that's, again, the little warning I'm giving with all of this, as I've been doing tonight, is that these are high-level teachings. It is extremely difficult to apply these teachings day in and day out with regard to what one experiences, especially the problems and difficulties. With prior training, however, you can more easily apply the thought transformation practice you have been practicing. So this is kind of pointing to, once more, this idea that you don't just like these athletes that I keep alluding to, who are Olympic athletes, they don't sit there and just have this strong conviction to do really well in their event and then wait till they get to the Olympics and say, okay, now I'm going to do it. They need to train. They need to train day in and day out, and every day put in the measured amount of time and effort so that they can continue to advance their progress, so that when they get to the Olympic event, they're at their peak and they're ready to actually engage in that. It's no different with regard to the practice of the Dharma. You're going to find limited success if you just simply hear these teachings tonight and then you go, okay, well then tomorrow when I have a problem, I'm going to be able to apply any one of these teachings and I'll be able to transform my problem into something that's just wonderful and delightful in my life. Maybe some of you will have that skill, and if you do, I honor you. But for most of us, these are things we have to work with. I find this to be some of the most challenging teachings of the Buddha, but they're also some of the most precious teachings, because they actually can help us to use those situations to find our deepest potential, to recognize that we are so much greater than what we tended to think of ourselves prior to this. We actually have a lot more to offer. But it takes training in these things to be able to bring them to bear in that moment. So what I'm going to go through the rest of tonight when we come back after our break is essentially go into teachings of the Lam Rim and how they are set out. Usually they don't put them in this order, at least they aren't in that text by Jigme Tempe Nema. And usually, again, if I have a whole weekend, I go into each of these in much greater depth. But at least tonight I'm going to touch on some of these. I'll see if we get through all of them and give you an idea of the variety of things that you can use as things to apply in terms of enhancing your Dharma understanding on the basis of the problem, the difficulty that you have in your life, whatever that might be. And in this way, you might be able to select a few of these. My job tonight isn't to give you all of these and expect that you're going to be able to practice all of them perfectly. Even if you spend a lot of time, dedicating yourself to it, you still may find that you will rely upon a few of them more than you rely upon others. And that will change over time, because once more, it's based on the graduated path and where you are in your own practice. But we need these tools. We need these things that will help us to transmute those situations into something very powerful for our practice. Because this is how we develop that second part of it. We actually learn to embrace our problems as sources of happiness, as beneficial, as, oh, good, I've got a problem in my life. Most of us don't think that way right now, right? But over time, we can. So let's see, I've got 8:07 on my computer here. Let's say I just went to 8:08. So let's say at 8:15, we'll resume. That gives everybody about 7 minutes or so to stretch, have a restroom break, whatever the case might be. And I'll pause the recording as well, and we'll start that up when we resume at 8:15. Okay, see you soon. Okay, so let's go ahead and get back into the slides then, which are, again, just going to go through all the various things that are set out. And again, there's maybe even more beyond this list, but these are the ones that are in Jigme Tempe Nima's text that are kind of different teachings that we can apply when we're experiencing problems that help us to reframe it. They're sort of like instead of that second arrow, they're more like a flower in place of that arrow. In fact, the course that I do on that entire text, I usually call it Turning Arrows into Flowers, which alludes to when the Buddha was achieving enlightenment, and the Maras, these malevolent beings, all threw arrows at him, and the arrows transformed into flowers through the power of the Buddha's concentration and his love and compassion and so on. So how do we actually take our thought processes when we are experiencing first arrows, when we're experiencing problems and difficulties, and make them into something beautiful, something that actually enhances our qualities, that actually makes us into better practitioners? So let's go into the slides and look at some of the topics. The preliminary advice, which is mentioned by Rinpoche, and of course I don't actually know if this is in Jigme Tempe Nima's text. I don't believe it is. But the idea is that we initially might frame our suffering or our problem, our difficulty, as the blessings of the Buddhas or the blessings of our gurus. What does this mean? Well, if we look at it from the point of view of what are the Buddhas or what are our gurus about? They are our teachers. They are the ones that are trying to instill in us the knowledge of the Dharma, the awareness of what it is that we need to do to change our minds, to move away from our unenlightened state to the state of Buddhahood, of enlightenment. Well, how are again, we can look at how our gurus, our teachers in this world manifest. They manifest, as people giving us teachings in formal settings or through personal advice or through the books that they write, and what have you. And so we gain it that way. But on an experiential level, how do we gain teachings when things that are challenging come into our lives, especially in this context that we're talking about tonight? So when we have problems or difficulties, one way that you can initially begin to sort of welcome it in is to say, oh, good, this problem is actually a manifestation of the Buddhas and the gurus giving me a lesson for the day, something that we can learn from, something that we can actually increase our understanding and our abilities from. So this is sort of the preliminary setting that I think is really useful to have. You know, when I was at the Light of the Path retreat, these retreats that have been done in North Carolina, I think there have been 5 or 6 of them. There was supposed to be another one this year, and they've canceled it postponed it till next September. But I was at one of these retreats. I think it was in 2014, I think it was. And on my way down to the Gompa to do the morning practice quite early, I think it was around 5:15 in the morning. It was raining that day, and I wasn't looking where I was going. It was still dark, of course, and I didn't have a flashlight. And in the process, I tripped on a little part of the walkway that was chipped away at the asphalt, and my foot got caught in there and I fell forward, and I put this huge gash. My glasses that I was wearing at the time, you know, went into the side of my face here, just missed my eye and put this huge gash in my face, you know. And of course, when this happened, I didn't think, oh, blessings of the Buddha. But, you know, I had the good fortune of running into Venerable Rabina while she was there at the retreat. She showed up a day or two later. And of course, I still had this really awful gash on the side of my face there. And, you know, she didn't even say anything about it. But as I was talking to her, I was feeling a bit self-conscious, and I told her what happened. And she was like, oh, congratulations. This is wonderful. This is like the best thing that could happen. You know, and one other person who was at the retreat actually did use the exact words, oh, maybe this was Lama Zopa helping you to, you know, work with this situation. You know, but if we see it as sort of like, this is a very important time for us to pay attention to and for us to learn from, that already changes what it is that we're looking for in terms of the situation changing, becoming something that we actually look at more favorably. Remember again that we want to get away from the unfavorable view that we have of it and to actually see it as something that we're delighted to have in our lives. Now, again, I work with my mind the whole time that I was at the retreat. I can't say I got to a point where I was delighted that this was going on. It was pretty painful and pretty awful. But nonetheless, you know, it does change over time. We do actually learn that we can develop some ability and some skill in the face of that if we begin by framing it this way, saying, oh, good, this is the Buddhas, the gurus, manifesting as a lesson for me. So that's kind of the preliminary teaching that helps us to get in the ballpark. Lama Zopa Rinpoche talks about that in his text. He says, when you have a problem, think, this is the blessing of the Buddha. This situation is purifying me by exhausting my negative karma and by helping me to train my mind in Mahayana thought transformation, you know, so that I can achieve enlightenment for the sake of all beings. I welcome this problem as an opportunity for me to train my mind. So again, this is like the initial thought that's good to have if you can muster it up. And, you know, again, through familiarity with this thought, if whenever there's a problem or a difficulty, something coming in, you can go, ah, this is the Buddhas, this is the gurus manifesting in a form for me to actually do this deeper work of mind training. How wonderful, you know. Now we're going to first look at those that pertain to the teachings of the small scope. I had on the screen earlier the 3 levels of the stages of the path, the Lam Rim. And the small scope, again, is where we look at this idea that we need to look at our situation very clearly, see that this life is going to come to an end, that we will have to be kind of taking charge in this life of how we actually create the causes for a good life after this, how we make sure that we have a good existence and that we do what we can to kind of remove the causes that will lead us into an unfortunate existence. So the very first of these teachings that we want to apply here is using our suffering to train in taking refuge. Here the idea is that when we have something that's happening in our lives that is problematic, it is a test to see where is our real refuge. You know, if our refuge is in the external world, which, as I mentioned earlier, tends to be how we look at things, and we put all of our faith in all of that being in place for us to be happy, well, then we're not going to be so successful at working with those problems and difficulties, because that's when the external world isn't working for us. Where is your refuge when you're dealing with problems? Again, the refuge is always talking about, you know, the 3 jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Buddha, of course, the historical figure, as well as all the enlightened beings, is an important part of our refuge. And the Sangha, the people in the community who have greater realizations of these topics, are an important resource for us. But the real refuge that we find that we have to remember at these times when things are difficult is the Dharma. And of course, this is another thought that's fed into the Lam Rim, but also influences the other topics that we're going to look at. Where do I put my real faith when things go bad? Do I think I, again, have to, rally against the world out there, or do I think I work with my own mind, work with my own thoughts to diminish the negative thoughts, to increase those that are more positive, to develop deeper understanding? This is the real measure of our practice of as Buddhists, is whether we're able to take refuge at those times. Problems and difficulties are a real testing ground for us to see where our refuge really is. If we have refuge in all that external stuff, well, then guess what? When that fails, we're not going to feel so good about ourselves. But if we have refuge within ourselves, in fact, the word for Buddhist in the Tibetan literally means an inner being, someone who is focused on the inner world, who does the inner work so that they're not contingent upon the external world for their happiness and well-being. So again, that's the idea behind that. Some of these I'm going to spend a little more time on, some a little less. That one to me is, maybe not as important, though it can be very important if that's what you're working on. If you're tending to focus mostly on teachings of the small scope and you want to enhance your refuge, then it's good when you confront a problem or a difficulty to think, oh, good, this is a chance for me to really test my refuge, to really see where I'm putting my confidence. Is it in the Dharma or is it in the external world? The second one, using suffering to purify harmful actions. Well, as was seen in that previous slide, where Rinpoche said that what is happening in terms of this problem is the ripening of my own negative karma. Well, that's the understanding by which we then begin to work with the concept that we need to be attentive to the negative karma that we've created. If you have a problem coming into your life, that you're experiencing, and maybe it could be a habitual problem, something that, someone that you work with that you have to deal with day in and day out, who's really challenging, for example. If you have that in your life, that's because you've created the karma for that. So how do you work with that? Well, first of all, don't create the same karma again. And that's, of course, a big thing to remember at these times when we're experiencing problems, is that if that irritating, annoying person is there every day, and we just keep creating the causes to have an irritating, annoying person in our lives by being rude and disrespectful and saying things to them that are not so beneficial, well, then we're going to just simply keep creating that pattern. This is, where karma is really about what are we doing with our minds, and then, of course, our speech and our behavior on the basis of that. But another aspect to this, and what this one is about, is to recognize that, especially if you do have something that is in your life on an ongoing basis, say, those difficult, annoying people who you tend to always have to work with, or say you have a pattern where where you say a lot of things that you think are useful to people and no one listens to you. They don't have any desire to take your advice or to follow what you say. Whenever you have something like that that's manifesting, you can see it as pointing out the things that you need to purify, the things that you need to work on. And even if it only happens every once in a while, it still is pointing out that you have created that type of karma. You've created the karma to have annoying people in your life. You've created the karma to have disease in your life. You've created the karma to have all the various things that we experience in our lives. So those are a wake-up call for us to recognize that we need to be attentive to our negative karma. Again, I won't go into all the teachings on karma because it's a huge topic in and of itself, but karma is essentially the concept that we are creating the sort of mental energy, and then again, that manifesting verbally or physically frequently, that has ramifications in the future. It's not a real simple linear kind of equation. It's not like I do this, like this is how we see karma in our world. If somebody does something that is harmful to somebody and then that happens to them, we go, oh, that's their karma. But karma is much more complex than that. It's a very dynamic process, and it has a lot of different rules by which it is governed. And it's impossible for us to know with our limited awareness all the intricacies of karma. But we can have some faith and confidence that there's some process behind why we're experiencing what we're experiencing, be it good, bad, or neutral. All of these things that are happening in our lives are a product of our own actions of the past. It doesn't make us horrible people if we have lots of problems. It simply means people that then need to pay attention to that and do what they can to purify that and to not engage in those actions again. So this is, again, part of one of the main teachings in the small scope is to work with karma and have an understanding of that. But it's not limited to the small scope, because karma is the fundamental principle of law, of cause and effect, the law that governs whatever experiences we have. So if we want to experience the bigger goals that are in Buddhism, we have to also create the causes and conditions for those. Causality is the most fundamental principle of Buddhism that governs the entire, process. If all the work that we did on our minds didn't have any effect in future existences or in future ways of experiencing things, well, then it wouldn't amount to anything. What the Buddha essentially says is that every moment we are creating the causes for what we experience in the future. What we are experiencing now, we created the causes for in the past. So we need to be attentive to this process. And of course, what was mentioned here specifically was the idea that when you have problems or difficulties in your life, those are the creation of your past negative karma. That past negative karma is exhausted to some degree by giving rise to that problem. If you have, the unfortunate situation of being diagnosed with some problem, some cancer, let's say a lower level cancer that can be treated or something, that's a ripening of a past karma that has come into your life now that is negative in its nature because it's causing you to experience some suffering, some difficulty. That should be a wake-up call to the need to purify negative karma. Because if we spend a lot of time attentive to that process, that will help us to be rid of that type of suffering. Again, over time, as I was saying, first arrows are going to keep happening. It's not like we're going to get rid of them all in one fell swoop through one little meager purification practice. But nonetheless, it's an awakening, a sort of connection of what's going on in the moment to what we need to do to work on the stuff we've done in the past, to abandon engaging in those negative actions now, but moreover, to kind of purify what we've done in the past. So again, most of you have had instruction in purification. I'm just going to go through the four elements of purification really quickly. First, we have to regret those actions. Now, again, we might not recall these because these might be from prior lives, but in the teachings in the Lam Rim, you can very clearly see why you're experiencing particular problems and difficulties, because it's all laid out in terms of the behaviors that give rise to certain results. So for example, people not hearing what you say, trusting it, having confidence in you, this is because you've disempowered your own speech through not being honest with what you've said, through using your speech to just engage in meaningless talk. Well, then we want to purify those sorts of things because we see that this is the karma we're experiencing. So the first step is to regret that we've done that. The second step is to rely upon our minds of refuge and developing a good motivation, intent upon the welfare of others because we've harmed others through those actions. That's our second limb, or second opponent power, reliance. The third is to actually engage in some sort of a remedy. And there are a number of remedies that are taught, such as Vajrasattva practice with the recitation of that mantra and so on. I won't go into all that, but essentially any virtuous action that we engage in with the intention of it acting as a purifying agent, as an antidote or a remedy, is sufficient. The fourth thing is that we have to make a resolve not to do those actions again. If we do all four of those very skillfully, then we can begin to weaken all that past negative karma. And we may even see within this life things shifting, people starting to have more confidence in what we're saying, for example, because we've been very meticulous about how we use our speech and we've purified the past actions that have made our speech less powerful. The next thing, I don't want to spend too much time on each of these. I want to make sure I touch on each of them. But this is an important one, is to really recognize that when we have problems or difficulties, it should remind us of the negative karma, the harmful actions we've engaged in, that we want to refrain from, and then purify those in the past. The other side of it, karmically, is that it will hopefully induce us to find greater joy in creating positive actions. So if we go back to that example of your speech not being so powerful, of people actually not hearing what you're saying and trusting it and so on, well, that will give you great joy to engage in making sure that you're very meticulous in how you use your speech, not just to avoid, some of the negative patterns of speech, but actually to make your speech very useful and beneficial for others, to use your speech in ways that bring people together, that cause them to know the truth, to hear the truth of the Dharma in their lives, if that's something that you can do for them, to make sure that the things that you say to them are meaningful and purposeful and not just chattering on about various things. This is again something that we can see, that when we are experiencing problems or difficulties, it's a reminder that not only do we need to refrain from doing those negative things that cause that, we need to engage in the positive virtuous deeds that bring about the opposite of that. Now, again, I realize that as we're going through this, some of you might go, well, but I thought you said we're not trying to look at our problems as necessarily problems. And, and it is true. But nonetheless, when we start talking about these deeper spiritual goals and what have you, we do need to move along the path and to engage in more virtue and to refrain from negative actions. And again, we can do that with a variety of motivations. The initial motivation that we're taught in the small scope is because we are the ones who will suffer. And it is true in these lojong teachings, we don't want to be so concerned about our own suffering and be able to embrace that as a rich opportunity to work with. But nonetheless, over time, we do want to diminish our own suffering. We do want to increase our own happiness. It's not denying that as part of our spiritual goal and our spiritual path. It's simply acknowledging that we have to work wherever we're at and try to be reminded of things that help us on our spiritual path. So again, if we're on the small scope, these are 3 ways that we can use, or if we're training mostly in the small scope in terms of our individual practice, you're mostly meditating on those topics, studying those topics. Use your problems or difficulties to enhance your mind of refuge, to refrain from and purify harmful actions, and then thirdly, to increase your desire to engage in more virtuous action, because you can use the problems in that way. Let's go on to the middle scope, where we look at kind of the deeper teachings about how we're in this cycle of existence and how we need to be free from that. Here, the first topic that is mentioned by Jigme Tempe Nima is using suffering to train in renunciation. Renunciation is a challenging word in English. I know that a lot of people, when they hear it, they think, I'm going to have to go up to the caves and the mountains and eat nettles and, not have any nice things in my life. This is what it means to renounce samsara, to renounce cyclic existence. But this isn't really what we mean by that. For some people, that may be what it looks like physically, but for most of us, it's primarily the state of mind that we have towards our existence, that we begin to see that what we are involved in is flawed, that we are dealing with an imperfect existence that has been perpetuated by our own state of mind. And we need to start turning away from that. Now, turning away from the difficulties and the problems and the suffering and the things that we already can identify as undesirable, that again, we're working with transmuting that to some degree, but nonetheless, we can see that those are not the ideal situation. That's not so much difficulty, but it is also, a part of the mind of renunciation to turn away from even the happiness that we have. That's why oftentimes renunciation is one of the main teachings that we use on the other side of the equation when we try to transform our happiness, our good things into the path, is to recognize that those things are fleeting and transitory, and that they aren't a solution to our problem. I mean, one can live one's life in great, great comfort. We can have everything taken care of for us. We can be born into a very rich family where we never have to worry about anything, and we're always taken care of. We always have access to good health care. We always have access to good resources, good food, and so on. But that all comes to an end when we die. All of that good experience that we had in this life doesn't amount to anything. Those things are transitory and incapable of ultimately satisfying, because when this life comes to an end, we get on the wheel of life again and we get propelled into another existence. And that one, who knows what the conditions will be in that one? They could be very, very different from this cushy life that we've lived in this existence. So there are no answers in terms of the happiness of this life. And certainly the suffering of this life indicates the unsatisfactory nature of our existence. So if we look at our problems or our happiness, either of them can be transmuted into a deeper understanding of renunciation. The Tibetan term for renunciation, Ngenjong has the idea of definite emergence. Emergence being the idea that you want to emerge from the cycle you've been involved in, the patterns you've been involved in since beginningless time. And the definiteness is that as that mind develops, it becomes a certainty that you are going to remove yourself from that. You are no longer going to be involved in that. You are going to transcend cyclic existence and achieve the peace of nirvana. And that is what the mind of renunciation essentially is the idea that you want to emerge from the cycle of existence, most definitely, and attain liberation. So again, this is another way that when we have problems in our lives, we can look at that as evidence of the unsatisfactory nature of existence. And as I was pointing out, even when you have happiness in your life, you can point to that and see also how it too is somewhat unsatisfactory. You have to use a little more thinking about it to see it that way. But all the good things, all the things that bring us some measure of pleasure in our lives, don't really satisfy in the end. You get to the end of this life, and let's say you did have that life of being born very rich and having everything taken care of. You have all those things you have to part from when you get to the end of this life, and you don't take one single thing with you, no matter how good life has treated you. All of that's gone. It's like a dream. Master Shantideva, in that same 6th chapter, he says, if you had a dream that lasted for just a minute, that where you experienced great pleasure, or it seemed like it lasted 100 years and you experienced great pleasure, it's no different when you wake up. That pleasure's gone. It's totally removed. So again, waking up to the reality of things in terms of this bigger picture is an important part of training and transforming suffering. But as I'm pointing out, it's also a good way to remind ourselves when we're experiencing even the good things in life that these are not satisfactory. We shouldn't be putting all our money on that. If we get all the good things in life and all the wonderful, pleasurable things, somehow we'll be okay. No, we get to the end of this life and all of that has to be left behind. Then the other teaching that was there on the screen had to do with pride and arrogance, using suffering to overcome arrogance. I actually found it interesting when the pandemic started and we were dealing with, the illness that was afflicting people from all different levels, certainly. We saw Tom Hanks, having coronavirus, COVID-19, and experiencing some of that. People who were at higher echelons, people who were at lower echelons, people everywhere in between, that it seemed to be sort of the great equalizer. They often talk about death in that regard, or any form of illness. And of course, we are seeing nowadays that in retrospect, that nonetheless, some people who are at the top obviously have the means to be able to avoid coronavirus much more than the people who have to work and have to continue, because they're essential workers at our time, continuing to experience great risk. So, but it was interesting that this sort of equalizing of people is something that we can apply in regard to anything that we see. When you're experiencing problems and difficulties in your life, it can deflate that sense of arrogance or pride, making you, the tendency that we have of thinking, oh, well, that'll never happen to me. How many of us see problems and difficulties in other people and have those thoughts, thinking, well, in the Christian tradition, they have that idea of there but for the grace of God go I. In Buddhism, it's like there but for the grace of my good karma go I. But it doesn't mean you don't have the bad karma to be experiencing that. You just don't have that right now, or it hasn't ripened for you right now. Every one of us, since we've been around since beginningless time, have created the causes for unbelievable suffering. We can be very grateful that in this moment in time, I'm assuming, like me, most of you aren't experiencing horrendous things going on right now. Might have some problems, some difficulties, but those problems and difficulties can wake us up to that reality that we're all sort of equal, that, that arrogance or that pride that sort of thinks that you're not the one that's going to be affected by that type of problem or that type of difficulty. It can be diminished greatly, kind of deflating all of that, bringing us back down to ground with some level of humility, some level of connection to others, recognizing that we're all in the same boat. And of course, pride is one of the major afflictions that gets in the way of our spiritual development. Yeah, we all have so much to learn. I feel like I learned so much from teaching to others and what they have to share, to me. I don't get as much interaction, it seems, when I'm teaching online as I do when I'm teaching in person. Sitting in a room with others, it's a little easier sometimes, I think, for people to ask questions and challenge things and what have you. But, this is the reality, is that we all have a lot to learn. Whatever level of education or, understanding we have, there's still a long way to go. And so problems and difficulties do tend to help level things, make us realize that we're not such hot stuff. We still are subject to all these various things happening. Certainly that was going through my mind. Maybe that was the bigger one I was working with when I fell at the retreat, was recognizing, oh, well, I have to recognize I created that kind of karma to be able to have that accident at the retreat and spend the whole rest of the retreat with a huge gash in my face and have to explain it to everyone that asked about it and what have you. So again, it does level you, bring you back down to earth. So I put that in there with the middle scope, because in the middle scope is where we're primarily trying to get rid of some of these afflictions that can become problematic. If we develop the mind of renunciation and remove the power of these afflictions, we can attain liberation. On to the great scope. The great scope, of course, is where all these teachings on lojong are primarily based, but it doesn't mean, again, that we only use our suffering and our problems to work at this level, because as I was pointing out earlier, you work at whatever level you're at, or you apply it in whatever way you feel is most relevant to your spiritual training at the time. Here we have the first one, using suffering to train in compassion. Of course, this is, very much in the vein of the Mahayana tradition, where we want to use what we are experiencing as problems as a touchstone to get connected to other sentient beings. Any of you, when you're experiencing any particular problem, although the particular specific manifestation of that might be unique in terms of who it is and what's going on and blah, 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 but the fact that you could still label it as something that is experienced by many, many others, it becomes an avenue through which you can connect to others who are suffering in a similar way, or who have suffered in a similar way, or who will suffer in a similar way. We have to be willing to use our suffering as an opportunity to open our hearts to the suffering of others. And of course, this is one of the big teachings in the Mahayana, is the ability to be empathetic with other people when we are experiencing problems and difficulties, to not let that become just about me, myself, and I, and what I need for my own well-being, but rather to enlarge our scope to include others who are just like us. Of course, again, this is something that we are seeing in our world right now with what's going on, because as I was mentioning earlier, I don't think there's a single being on the planet, at least human being, though of course even the animal world is being greatly affected by this. There certainly isn't a human being that isn't being impacted to some degree by this pandemic. Some people to lesser degrees than others, but we're sort of all in the same boat. When we have to experience something that is a challenge to our well-being, is it an avenue for us to connect with others, or once more, do we get more preoccupied with ourselves? So the first step is to really open our hearts with compassion to the suffering of others, to really look at this as a way to make sure that we don't become blind and insensitive to the suffering of the world. Because when we get into the great scope, again, it's all about bodhicitta motivation. And bodhicitta motivation is based in what we call great compassion. Compassion is the thought of not wanting others to suffer. We see the suffering that we're experiencing, and we can translate that into the wish that others not experience similar suffering. Great compassion is when we actually take the responsibility for removing that suffering. It's like if you were looking at coronavirus and all what's happening and the sickness that's occurring, you can see it as a touchstone to not want beings to have to experience that type of suffering, but to make it into something that makes you want to remove that suffering. which of course people in the medical profession can help to do by treating people and intubating people and doing all the things that help them to heal from that illness, hopefully, though many do succumb. But nonetheless, that motivation that says, not only do I not want you to suffer, I'm going to do what's necessary to help you to not suffer, to protect you from suffering. That's the mind of great compassion. And of course, that doesn't mean that we all have to go out and train to become medical professionals so we can work with this. If the deeper training that we want to do is train ourselves to become fully enlightened so we can remove all the causes of suffering in ourselves and of course help others to do that as well. So again, this is that deeper level of compassion that we're directing it at, that we're not just simply moved to feel bad that others are suffering. We want to do something about it. We actually want to take that personal responsibility. So that's the first level in terms of the great scope, just touching on that concept of compassion. The second one moves more into that I mentioned earlier, the two techniques for developing bodhicitta. The one that is more firmly rooted in the lojong teachings, it's called equalizing and exchanging self and others. And here the idea is that we want to use our suffering to cherish others more than yourself. As that technique says, to exchange self and others. First, we have to equalize ourselves and others, to recognize that others are just like ourselves. But then we eventually, over time, want to hold them more precious and dear. Right now, most of us work with this concept that's usually called self-cherishing, but I like to call it self-centeredness. We live our lives very much focused on me, myself, and I, and what I need for my well-being. And we tend to think of others as the means to accomplish that for ourselves, rather than as ourselves as the means to accomplish their happiness. So we live our lives very much looking for what we need in other people to satisfy our own wants and our own desires. And again, each of us has this to a greater or lesser degree. But they say even some of the practitioners on the Hinayana have it in a very subtle way where they become kind of not so eager to be dedicating themselves fully to the welfare of other beings. Well, if we're ever to generate this mind of bodhicitta, if we are ever to be fully committed to the path to enlightenment, we have to have the willingness to hold others as most dear and most supreme in our lives. And the lojong teachings are very much centered on this concept. This is another part of them that is really about embracing cherishing others, holding them to be most precious and most dear. Many of you have heard of the 8 verses of thought transformation, which are one of the briefest, if not, I think it may be the briefest text in the whole lojong corpus. It's very much about the techniques that are involved in this type of development of bodhicitta, where we start to see the problems of being solely focused on our own welfare. This is one of the biggest obstacles we have to achieving Buddhahood, much less to developing bodhicitta, is that if we're only going to be focused on ourselves, well, then we're never going to embrace fully the welfare of others. Now, again, it doesn't mean that you're neglected as part of this, because the path to enlightenment assures that you will be taken care of. It's about developing yourself completely into a Buddha so that you then can be dedicated to others. But the main impetus for doing this is the suffering of others and the wish for them to be happy. So, of course, one of the main techniques that's practiced in the lojong tradition that we can also do as part of our own experience of problems and difficulties is the practice of tonglen. And I could give much more extensive instruction on this, but because I don't have so much time, let me just give the principle of it. It's called tonglen, which essentially is giving, tong, and taking, len. But it's usually practiced in the reverse order. This is about compassion, taking away suffering, and developing love, which is giving happiness. And it's done through a visualization technique where we work with others at the time that we're experiencing problems. So say you do have something difficult coming into your life, and let's just use something like a headache, a really bad headache, maybe from the smoke in the air and what have you, that from the fires. We have a really bad headache at the end of the day. And we tend to want to just focus on, well, I feel horrible, I just need to take care of myself. Well, nothing wrong at some level, because you're a suffering sentient being, and it's fine for you to have the impetus to want to not suffer. But if that makes you not take full advantage of that headache to actually open up to the suffering of others, tonglen is a way to rectify that. And it's for, at the time when you're experiencing that headache, for you to think about the others who have a headache, to think about all beings who are experiencing whatever suffering they're experiencing. And to think, even just to have the thought, through my experiencing that headache, may that become the cause to remove their suffering, to take away their suffering. You don't even have to make it into an intricate practice, even if you just hold that thought. And then maybe you take a pill, to help you to get rid of your headache. And you can think while you're taking the Excedrin or Tylenol or whatever it is that you take, through my relief of that headache and experiencing the comfort of being free of it, may all beings be free of that. Whatever you're working with in terms of your experience of suffering or any relief from that suffering or happiness you experience, you think of others experiencing it too. That's one level of Tonglen. But then we can get into the very courageous levels of Tonglen, where we think about taking on all of those headaches, all of that pain, all of that suffering, willing to endure it ourselves so that others don't have to experience it. And then willing to be giving away everything that we have to others so that they can experience true joy and happiness and peace and not be so concerned about our own well-being. Again, these are techniques that I'm sure each of you have run across here and there. Tonglen is taught in a variety of ways, and I won't go into it in too much detail. But know that this is kind of what we're talking about at this level of practice. When you have problems or difficulties, look at them as a source of being able to connect with the suffering of others and engage in this very powerful practice of wishing to take it away. Others are no different from you. That's the equalizing part of it, is to see that when you have a headache and you don't feel like dealing with that and you really want to take something to get rid of it, others are just like you in the exact same way. Nobody wants a headache. Nobody's like looking for a headache. So identify with the suffering of others, but moreover, really take on that courage that would, be willing to endure other suffering so that they don't have to experience it. So that's the idea behind that. Those two are kind of working with those qualities that are so much a part of the Mahayana path. Compassion, which becomes the root of our bodhicitta, and then of course this very deeper way of addressing the problem of the self-centered mind and learning to make others more important than oneself, to cherish them more dearly than yourself. The third way that we can use within the Mahayana, which of course is primarily taught within the Mahayana, though it's essential part of the middle scope in terms of achieving liberation. But it's taught in the Mahayana because that's where we incorporate it into the practices of the Bodhisattva, what are called the 6 perfections or paramitas, is to cultivate the perfection of wisdom, which is the understanding of emptiness. So again, with the little bit of time I have left, I'm not going to be able to go into deep teachings on emptiness, but emptiness is essentially one of the most unique and powerful teachings that the Buddha gave in terms of the wisdom component that addresses the fundamental source of all of what we call our problems and difficulties. So when you have a problem in your life, that was created and is experienced as a problem through the force of what we call sort of our self-grasping, this tendency to concretize and solidify ourselves and think that we have some sort of independent existence, to not see that we actually exist in dependence upon a number of factors, that there's no sort of autonomous standalone person that we tend to protect at those times. If we are able to use the teachings on emptiness, which again are beyond the scope of what we can talk about tonight, this is one of the most powerful ways to work with our suffering, to make it into a source of understanding that the root of all of this can be undermined through this wisdom that realizes that we are a dependent arising, that everything arises in dependence upon its causes and conditions, everything arises in dependence upon its parts. And in the end, the subtlest way that everything exists is through the force of our designation, our imputation. The reality that we have invested in so much through the force of our ignorance doesn't exist at all. There is reality, but reality is very, very slight. It's only through mere designation, mere imputation, that anything exists. So again, I'm talking about these things in a very shorthand way. Those of you who've had teachings on emptiness can maybe identify with some of the concepts I'm laying out. If you haven't, well then seek them out. And I don't know that I'll have a chance to go into them so much through the time that I'm here, because I'm mostly focusing on kind of these other qualities. This weekend we'll be doing the four immeasurables, which are primarily touching on heart qualities, sort of the compassion wing, whereas the wisdom wing is a little bit more involved. But nonetheless, the teachings are out there. Lama Zopa Rinpoche is a great expounder on emptiness, and it's useful to go to those sorts of masters like His Holiness and Lama Zopa and really seek out their teachings to help elucidate that very profound truth of emptiness that is a final way in this exposition tonight of how to work with problems and difficulties, that we see that what is creating all of this and what's at the center of all of this is this ignorance, this grasping at ourselves as having a level of existence that isn't there at all. It's a mistake that we've been making since beginningless time, and it can be undone through that wisdom. And this should be a source of amazing joy, because we recognize that at the root of all of it is something that doesn't have to be there, something that actually can be rectified through the Buddha's teachings on that. So let me go through the final little slides that I have here and then see if there might have time for one or two questions. But I wanted to share some of Rinpoche's thoughts on this in terms of how we work with this. He says, generate a very strong positive motivation, determining that from now on, no matter what problems I have to face, I won't become irritated by them. I won't identify any circumstances or obstacles I experience as problems. I'll regard them as positive. Why? Because I can see that they are the means for me to work on all these different things we just talked about. They are the source of temporal and ultimate happiness. Generating this brave, determined attitude, he says, is extremely important for your thought transformation practice to succeed. I mentioned earlier that we do have to engage in the training, but it also means having this kind of courageous attitude, this very brave mind that's going to face one's own problems and difficulties and see them in this new light and work with them as a source of joy. With this strong motivation as a foundation, proceed to train your mind until you become like an experienced horseman. Even though his mind may be distracted, he is able to manage the horse effortlessly, no matter what it does, without falling off or endangering his life. He's able to cope because his body responds naturally to the way the horse runs, just like our mind will respond naturally to whatever it is that we experience. So similarly, when meeting miserable conditions or obstacles, an experienced thought transformation practitioner immediately and effortlessly recognizes them as good. The thought of liking problems arises naturally then, like the thought of liking ice cream or the thought of liking music. When a person who enjoys music hears music, the thought of liking it arises naturally without any need to consider the reasons. So again, thank you for your attention tonight, and I do hope that you're able to apply these teachings in your life and learn to like your problems as much as you like ice cream or music, or fill in the blank with whatever it is that is your go-to thing. But I think it's a really wonderful example. Like you don't sit there and think, oh, should I like this music or shouldn't I? You just naturally like it. The music comes on and you go, oh, wow, I'm so glad to hear that. Do we have that with our problems? That would be pretty advanced, so that when something comes into your life that's pretty disastrous, you don't even think, I need to look at this a little bit differently. You just instantly see it as something joyous and something wonderful. So any questions or comments in terms of what we've looked at tonight? Again, I imagine that many of you have heard these teachings before, but I hope that the way I presented them and some of the things I brought in, and as I mentioned, this is an older edition of Rinpoche's book, Transforming Problems into Happiness. I think it's been republished with a beautiful photo of Rinpoche on the front. But as I said, it's a very thin little book, and it's well worth reading. And it's his sort of commentary on this root verse, root text that's at the back of this, that is also worth exploring. And yeah, I really like this text a lot, of course, and I love these teachings a lot, but That doesn't mean I'm a great practitioner of them. Don't get mistaken in that idea. But I hope that through my sharing these tonight, I've given you some perspective on how to use these teachings to, again, make them doorways. Everything that we experience, reframe how we're looking at it. Don't see it as completely unfavorable. See it actually as something that could be a source of great joy and benefit. Again, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to feel happy in the moment. You know, you're still going to potentially be experiencing that pain, that difficulty, but your mind will be much different because you see that there's some room to work with it, some room to use that teaching in a more constructive way. All right. If there are no questions, then again, let me go ahead and do, well, there's something in the chat box. Oh, just a thank you. That's very kind. Okay, let's go to the prayers. And I'll share on the screen the dedication prayers that I'm going to do for the teachings that I'm going to do with you guys this week. On the left, the two dedication prayers that I think you're probably familiar with, where we dedicate all this positive potential that we've created through hearing these teachings, thinking about them, and so on, that we make sure that this is not wasted in the least, but brings forth the result of our own enlightenment and thus the enlightenment of all beings. And then the second verse, which is recollecting this mind of bodhicitta and wishing for this to be cultivated very deeply in our own minds, but also to think about others as we're reciting this. And Rinpoche, in some of the teachings at the Light of the Path, the last retreat that was done in 2017 after the election, Rinpoche made sure that he said, after he said, may the supreme jewel bodhicitta, all this be developed, especially in the hearts of all Americans, and particularly in the hearts of Donald Trump. And so we can think about Donald Trump, we can think about other world leaders, we can think about other politicians on whatever side of the fence. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we lived in a world where all the beings who are leading and guiding were motivated in this way? That they had this mind of bodhicitta. What a different world we would live in. So have that very far-reaching thought as we recite that verse in particular. So let's recite those two verses on the left-hand side first. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then let's go to the right-hand side of the screen, and here we talked earlier about gurus, teachers, and how important it is that we see the way that they're working in our lives. And they do work in very direct ways as well by helping us to understand the Dharma and practice it. So here we're going to think about these two teachers, His Holiness and Lama Zopa, and make strong prayers for their good health and their long lives. But as we do this, we can extend that out to all the other spiritual guides in this world, in Buddhist traditions as well as non-Buddhist traditions. If they are helping others to have a deeper understanding of spirituality and morality and so on, may they have good health and long lives and continue to benefit others. And may we and others always have perfect guides in our lives. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then in the spirit of that kind of compassionate connection to others, let's bring to mind those that we're holding in our hearts right now and dedicate for them. So every one of us knows individuals or are thinking of groups of people, who are experiencing various suffering in this world right now, people who have obstacles, people who are ill, people who are dying or who have died. Bring them to mind and sort of funnel that positive energy to them specifically. It's not that we don't want others to experience that, but those are beings we have a connection with. So take advantage of that and use this compassionate motivation to think that what we've done here tonight goes to their benefit, helps to remove their suffering, and helps them to find all the causes that will lead to perfect peace and happiness. And then extend this out to all beings. May all beings find true peace and happiness through what we've done here tonight. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining tonight. I think my topic for Friday is working with fear. Yes, is that? I think so. And then again, for the weekend, we'll work with this 4 paths to awaken a kind heart, kind of taking kind of some teachings, but I'm really hoping to be helping to give an experiential taste. If I've got time, I don't know, it's hard with the time that we have to at least do a short meditation on each of those 4 immeasurables so that we can kind of incorporate them into our hearts. I think it's really a very precious teaching, but we'll be looking at them from a Mahayana perspective. So wonderful. Again, thank you all so much. Please do stay safe, especially all those. How far away are these fires that you're experiencing? Are they very close to?
Probably
No.
2 or 3 hours, but
2 or 3
our
hours.
air quality is really awful.
Yeah, I can't
So
imagine. We've had fires here in New Mexico that have been kind of bad like that, but no, it's really, really challenging, especially with everything else going on. My gosh, So we have stuff to work with. And so, again, I wish you well with your work with these teachings tonight. And I'll look forward to joining you again on Friday then. So, all right, blessings to you. Take care. Thank you.
thank you so much, Don.
Okay. All right. I'm going to end the recording.